Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 5 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Nashville Predators, which the Sharks have lost 5-1. So finally, the San Jose Sharks were coming out of the tough start of the season where they had to face off against last year's 4 division winners in 4 straight games. Obviously, not many people were expecting the Sharks to put up much of a fight in those games, but they were finally coming to a slightly easier portion of the schedule with a game against the Nashville Predators, who certainly are no slouch of a team, but not exactly at the level of those top competition opponents. And so it was expected that the Sharks could put up a slightly better performance here tonight, not necessarily getting a win, but perhaps give them a bit of a measuring stick for what we could expect going into the rest of this season against a team who is likely to find themselves on the bubble when it comes to a playoff spot. And yet here tonight, even though the Sharks still managed to, for the first time this season to get like a 30-plus shots on goal game and had some decent chances on net, it was still a game that at the end of the day was a 5-1 loss for San Jose and still very disappointing to watch. Now, at the beginning of this season, I made not exactly a prediction, but I talked about how this season was likely to be more exciting from a San Jose Sharks perspective for a couple of reasons. The first of which with the amount of new faces that the Sharks would have in the lineup, picked up from different teams around the league, as well as the second reason being the youth that would be injected into the lineup that could also be very interesting to watch how their development would go. And yet 5 games into the season, that excitement is completely missing from the San Jose Sharks. Many of the sort of new faces to the team have been pretty disappointing. Duclair hasn't done much. Hoffman hasn't done much. Granlund's been injured. A couple of the defensemen that were added, like Burrows and Ruda, Burrows has been pretty good, but these are defensive type of guys. Nobody's really shining in any which way. And so there hasn't been any excitement there besides maybe Mackenzie Blackwood in goal. And then from a youth perspective, Bortolo was a healthy scratch here tonight. Thrun was sent down to the Barracuda. Only Eklund remains at this point, and even he has struggled to really shine in the 5 games that the Sharks have played. And so that predicted excitement level has yet to even arrive 5 games into this season. At the very least last year, which I talked about how it was so boring to watch as a San Jose Sharks fan, at the very least there was Erik Karlsson and Timo Meier at the beginning of the season who both could put up solid performances even in Sharks losses. Karlsson randomly getting like 3 or 4 point games while Timo Meier was dominant like 90% of the time as he was put on the ice. There hasn't even been a single player in a single game for the San Jose Sharks who I would categorize as having a great game. In fact, even a good game is pretty far out of reach for every single player on the Sharks roster outside of their goaltender. And so it's just been generally disappointing to watch, even with this 5th game being against slightly easier competition. Perhaps when the Sharks will be facing off against the really weak competition, a la the Chicago Blackhawks or the Anaheim Ducks, there is a possibility that things could get a bit more exciting, but yet not hopes being particularly high at this point. But let us jump in quickly to how this game ended up going. The Predators would take an early lead that they would never relinquish in this game on the power play to make it 1-0 after 20 minutes. They then have the only 2 goals of the third period, both coming very, very quickly, one after the other. This is now the, I believe, 4th time this season in 5 games where the Sharks have given up a goal, and then within the next, 30 seconds or so, they would give up another goal right after that, which has just been completely disastrous for any possible comeback attempts or anything like that. When you give up that one goal, obviously you're not going to like it, but it's the way the game goes. You are eventually going to give up goals, but when you give up a second goal so quickly after the next one, that's where that sort of despair and demise feels like it sets in, where you start to believe, okay, we have no chance in this game. And the fact that this has happened in every game barring the Colorado one is very, very telling at where this team's mentality is in the early parts of the season, which is just not very good. If it's like this in March or April when the team is so far out of a playoff spot, it's understandable, but for it to be like this in the early parts of the year in October, that's quite worrying. Then in the third period, the Predators would add another goal to make it 4-0, another one on the power play, which, by the way, I do want to mention the Sharks' penalty kill has been very bad this season, it feels like. Even last year, where the Sharks were a very bad team, right near the bottom of the standings, their penalty kill was extremely competitive, even though their goaltending was terrible, one of the worst tandems in the entire league. They still managed to have pretty good goaltending at shorthanded and ended up with the, I believe, 7th best penalty kill in the league. This year, though, they haven't been doing any of the same things that they found success with last year. Not only are they not really pressuring along the boards to try and keep things to the perimeter, but they're also allowing way too much penetration inside of the 4-man box that they set up about at least 3 times this game. On the Predators power play, did they manage to sneak a guy right into the slot to get a very good chance on Blackwood, and actually Novak's goal, which was the second power play goal of this game, came off exactly that play. So it's been extremely disappointing to watch the Sharks penalty kill, which was the last bastion of hope pretty much for the Sharks last season. So even if that's not going well, what do the Sharks really have to hang on to at this point? Anyhow, the Sharks would respond with their classic 1 goal of the game, the 4th time in 5 games in which they've only managed a single goal on the night. This one coming from Hertl as it takes a bounce off the backboards. Classic Sharks defenseman taking a shot that goes wide, but this time a lucky bounce happens that allows Hertl to get his first of the season. But it is pretty quickly answered with an Evangelista goal to make it a 5-1 Predators game to end it off. Moving on to the players to talk about, honestly, it's just getting very, very tiring to go through these players and have to rate them in such a relative sense where it's, oh, well, none of them have actually played well, but at least compared to each other, some people kind of emerged as being a difference maker-ish. So it's definitely getting rather tiring, but I guess we shall continue with that. The first line is Hertl, Barabanov, and Duclair, the one line that is kept together from last game, and it was perhaps the Sharks' best line of the night. Hertl, who I've been quite hard on this season, I feel as though had his best game of the year, still certainly nowhere near the dominant level that you would hope from Hertl, that you would expect from Tomas Hertl, but he had a few really good shifts, especially near the latter parts of this game. Of course, also managed to get a goal in this one, his first of the season, so at the very least, some good things there. And his 2 wingers, while I would say a step below Hertl, and in particular Duclair was likely the weakest link on this line, they both had their moments as well to make this a solid first line for the San Jose Sharks. But past that is where things begin to fall apart, where there's, I guess, technically 8 forwards here for the San Jose Sharks, and most of them did pretty much nothing in this game. But I do quickly want to talk about some lineup decisions made by David Quinn, which honestly feel like multiple steps backwards compared to how this season has started. So 2 players stepped out of the lineup here tonight, the first of which being Thomas Bordeleau, which is both a surprise but also not a surprise, as we learned from David Quinn last season. He holds the inexperienced and young players to an exceptionally high standard, as his reasoning for Thomas Bordeleau's benching here tonight is that he had a bad game 3 and then also a bad game 4, and so 2 games in a row means you get benched, which, if that was a philosophy that David Quinn actually stuck with for pretty much every player on the team, we would not have seen a player like Oscar Lindblom get like 80 games last season, considering he could string together a dozen, if not more, terrible games in a row. So the fact that Bordeleau gets benched after 2, and I would argue that honestly last game Bordeleau was not all that bad compared to the rest of the team, he ends up getting benched anyhow, so he steps out. And the other player to step out is definitely even more surprising, Giovanni Smith, who I thought had a really good preseason, a really strong start to the season in the first few games. Yes, the other night against the Boston Bruins, Giovanni Smith did not play a good game, but I feel as though he certainly deserved to still remain in the lineup, especially sort of the good karma that he built up in the earlier parts of the season, if, you could really call a 5-game season thus far an earlier part. But it just feels weird that he ends up getting sidelined for this one, and especially since it's in favor of running an 11 forward, 7 defenseman setup. And the thing here is that if the Sharks, for instance, were able to insert Jacob McDonald as that 7th defenseman, it could make some sense, because at the very least McDonald could play in a forward role and bring some offensive talent to the game. But Emberson is a defensive guy making his NHL debut here, and so you're essentially just removing offense from the lineup on a team that has managed to score, just, at least with this game in mind, 7 goals in 5 games, which by by the way, in the high-scoring NHL that we have been in over these past few seasons, is exceptionally awful. Anyhow, moving on to what the second line looked like, this was just a weird combination of players, Eklund, Sturm, and Kunin. It should be noted that there was a bit of a musical chairs in terms of centermen this game. Frequently, Sturm would get shifts down with Zadina and LeBanc, and then upwards and downwards, and Peterson would get shifts at the middle, and basically, a lot of different things kind of happened here. It was rather weird to see the lineup combinations, especially since early on in this season, you have a lot of new players in the lineup. You are expecting to try and develop some chemistry. So the fact that you're basically creating a merry-go-round of players in this game seems to go against that. But then again, I'm not an NHL coach, so perhaps I have no idea what I'm talking about. But on this second line, I thought Kunin was not particularly useful in this game, did very little throughout most of it, which has been kind of his MO at times. Besides getting a few high danger chances off of the back of other players' good work, he hasn't really done much of anything himself. Nico Sturm, I thought, was a bit awkward defensively, which was a bit of a change of pace considering he's usually rather reliable in that particular role, but I don't think he necessarily had a terrible game. And then when it comes to William Eklund, obviously there was the one big issue, which was, I believe, on the first Novak goal, the one that made it 2-0 Nashville, where he completely loses his man. I will mention that I won't put all of the blame on William Eklund. Something that the Sharks have had a tendency to do defensively this season is overload one side of the ice, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does require very good communication with your forwards who will be responsible defensively, and that has been something that has failed for the San Jose Sharks probably half a dozen times thus far this season. And while they haven't always ended up in the back of the net, a lot of the times they do, and it did here tonight. So Ruda heavily moving to the left side of the ice, leaving Eklund all alone, and in fact Novak all alone because Eklund doesn't cover his man, just feels like a bit of a weird play in general, yet it is seemingly something the Sharks are prioritizing doing. So there will be a necessary step up in communication if the Sharks are to continue to do exactly that. When it comes to the third line, sort of, again, we have Zetterlund, Peterson, and Hoffman. So Peterson is the one forward to step in favor of Bordelot and Giovanni Smith. Peterson has played a couple of games prior to this one. He's been relatively invisible in those. I would say that continued here tonight. I mean, the night and day comparison between what Peterson looked like in those last few games that he played for the San Jose Sharks at the end of last season compared to the few games that he has played at the start of this season, it's just quite stunning to see how far he has fallen off. He started out on the third line, so not exactly the best line mates to be playing with when he came at the end of the season, and yet he ended up finishing on the first line because of how well he looked, and he just looks like a completely different player this season. So that has probably been one of the more low-key disappointing player performances for the Sharks this season. When it comes to his two wingers, Hoffman continues to really do not much. At least he's not a liability, which is something I essentially have just said about him every single game, but he hasn't been any sort of positive for the San Jose Sharks yet. He is a player who thrives purely in the offensive zone, which the Sharks have been avoiding like the plague for most of this season. And then when it comes to Zetterlund, I found that Zetterlund had been looking quite good in a fourth line role, so I have zero clue why David Quinn decided to disrupt the Sturm, Zetterlund, Giovanni Smith fourth line that had been run for the first 4 games of the season and had looked quite solid. Zetterlund now finds himself on the pseudo third line for the San Jose Sharks and didn't really do much of anything, looked a lot more like the Fabian Zetterlund of last season compared to the Fabian Zetterlund of the first few games of this season. And then when it comes to the fourth line, which wasn't really a fourth line, we have both Zadina and Kevin LeBanc. Zadina, I thought, had a really bad game, probably his worst as a San Jose Shark thus far, just didn't really contribute in any way offensively. LeBanc, on the other hand, strung together a second straight very solid game, and these are the types of games that he will need to continue to put up if he wants to remain in the lineup. He should know that his leash with David Quinn is basically like half an inch at this point with how many times he has been healthy scratched for absolutely no reason, and so there is no room for a misstep if you are Kevin LeBanc. You need to be putting up solid performances. And tonight, like a couple of nights ago against Boston, was a good step towards that. Then when it comes defensively, you see the San Jose Sharks had a bit of an awkward setup because, yes, they did dress 7 defensemen, and yet for whatever reason, they only really ran with 5 of them. the two players who kind of sat out for much of this game was Emberson, who I wouldn't say necessarily sat out, but wasn't really given a hefty amount of ice time in what was his NHL debut, which is relatively understandable, though in the ice time that he did play, I will say, actually looked pretty good, so that could perhaps throw an interesting wrench into the right-handed defenseman plans for the San Jose Sharks, because there has been one weak point for the San Jose Sharks, it feels like. I mean, there's been a dozen weak points for the Sharks, but on defense, the one right-handed defenseman who has looked bad on a consistent basis is not Burrows or Benning, but in fact Jan Ruda, who again actually ended up with not a lot of ice time here this game. It seems as though David Quinn indeed agrees with me that Ruda has not been particularly impressive at all, and so while I don't think the more veteran Ruda will end up losing his NHL spot to Emberson, because as I mentioned earlier, there is a heavy bias from David Quinn to favor the more experienced players over the more inexperienced players, but it is definitely an interesting sort of race to watch, I guess. The other defenseman who didn't end up getting the time of day here tonight was Marc-Edouard Vlasic. Now, I don't exactly know the situation with Vlasic. Was this an active benching by David Quinn with the fact that he only ended up with about 6 minutes of ice time, or was this like an aggravated injury for him? Because there was an earlier injury a couple of games ago that's kept him sidelined for one game. I'm honestly not entirely sure, but it could very well be a healthy scratch type of situation, or a sort of a healthy benching type of situation when it comes to Vlasic, because it's not as though he's been particularly good at all this season. In fact, he's been rather bad. And so if David Quinn actually had the guts to bench Vlasic and then healthy scratch him moving forward in this season, at least that would be some commendations to him. When it comes to the other defenseman for the night for the San Jose Sharks, I thought Knyzhov looked decent enough, which has been nice for him thus far this season. Ferraro, I thought this was one of his weaker games of the year, though still not terrible. Kyle Burrows was rather solid, as he has been all season. And the last player, Matt Benning, kind of bounced around a bit in this game. I haven't been a huge fan of Benning thus far this season. A slow start for him like he had in his season debut with the Sharks last year, but I guess not all that bad. And then when it comes to the goaltender for the San Jose Sharks, Mackenzie Blackwood ends up back between the pipes, and is yet another game where he ends up getting lit up a bit, but yet another game where I don't exactly blame him all that much. The Evangelista one was on a breakaway. The Novak one was just the first Novak one, I should say, was just, or the second Novak one was terrible coverage. The first one was also terrible coverage, honestly. The Sherwood one gets deflected on the way, so it's a tough save to make as well. It was just generally hard game for Blackwood to actually put up a solid performance. Obviously, if he had really stood on his head like he did against the Colorado Avalanche, he could have perhaps made a couple more saves, but am I really going to fault him in that regard? Especially since, as I mentioned earlier on, the Sharks have put up only a single goal in each of the 4 out of the 5 games that they have played thus far this season, so there is literally zero offensive support coming to him. He would actually have to put up a shutout to give the Sharks a chance to win a game finally this season, because they are currently finding themselves 0-4-1. Just an absolutely terrible start to the season for the San Jose Sharks. It's not certainly out of the ordinary, I would say, because they started terribly last season as well. They did eventually come out of it and look okay moving into November. That could very well still happen here, but it's not a great start. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, and we'll see if they can finally get back, or not even get back, but finally find themselves in the win column, because can they really go 0-82 this season? It would certainly seem that way based on how they're playing, but it's likely a win will eventually show up. It's just a matter of when. Class dismissed.